Hey everyone, welcome to Sidetrack Adventures. This is Steve. Right now we're in North San Diego County, right outside of the city of Escondido, and today we're going to be exploring a true hidden gem of the area, a place that's filled with history dating back to the mid-1800s, and well, even before that. But at one point, they were going to turn all of this into a housing development. So today we're going to be exploring the Daley Ranch. Daley Ranch is a nature preserve that encompasses over 3,000 acres of hills, valleys, and ponds on what was once a massive ranch that dates back to the 1860s. The Daley family owned this land for over 100 years, but in the 1980s, they teamed up with Mobil Oil to try and turn this area into a housing development with over 3,000 houses and a golf course. The economy took a downturn, and the plans to develop this area were put on hold. In 1997, the city of Escondido bought the land for $21 million to designate it as a conservation mitigation bank. Now there are over 25 miles of hiking, biking, and equestrian trails here. Our plan today is to take several of the trails to kind of make a loop through the lower half of the ranch and explore its history. We should see several of the ponds, climb the second highest peak on the ranch, which is also the highest peak that we're allowed to climb, and see the historical ranch buildings. Hopefully we'll also see some wildlife. Mountain lions have been seen in the area, but it's pretty unlikely we'll run into one of those. There are signs along the trail identifying some of the plants, and you definitely got to look out for this stuff. It is everywhere out here. We'll get more in depth into the history of this place a little bit later, but the ranch was settled in 1868 by a 23-year-old man named Robert Daley. He had moved to San Francisco from London, England, and after a bit came down to this area. He liked this valley so much, he decided to stay. And I'll continue on after I cross the stream here. I don't want to fall in. Okay, so the land hadn't been surveyed yet, so he wasn't able to legally homestead here, but that didn't stop him. He built a cabin and pretty much squatted on the land for 7 years. In 1875, he was legally able to obtain ownership of 160 acres, and eventually that would grow to over 3,000 acres. Now that we've gotten a little bit higher, we're starting to get some pretty good views. That's the city of Escondido off in the distance, and Dixon Lake right below us. We're getting our first look at Stanley Peak in front of us, and the plan is to head to the top of it. It probably doesn't show up that well in the camera, but that water tank on the side of the mountain played a small part in San Diego history. We should get a closer look at that in a bit. Of course, long before this area was a ranch, it was the home of Native Americans such as the Kumeyaay and the Luiseño, but the area was empty of human habitation by the time Daley settled here. And while Robert Daley settled this place, it would be his sons who would become super rich and literally build the streets of San Diego. Most of the trails through here are old ranch roads, and most of the trail maintenance is done by the Friends of Daley Ranch and the San Diego Mountain Biking Association. This place is extremely popular with mountain bikers. We've probably seen more people on mountain bikes than we've seen hikers, and we haven't seen anyone on horseback yet. I think I mentioned earlier that this place is a hidden gem. Well, it's definitely not a secret to the mountain biking community, that's for sure. But I don't know about you, I'd much rather walk up this hill than try to ride a bike up it. Looks like we have another viewpoint here. The views just keep getting better and better. And there's Escondido off in the distance again. Had this place not been saved, this whole area would look like that. We're getting closer to the water tank. That should be our next stop. So far we've gone about maybe 3 miles or so, and our total loop today should be about 7.5 miles. I bet coming down the hill on those bikes is a lot of fun, but probably not so much heading up. We've turned off the main trail to get a better look at this water tank. So this water tank was the water tank for Rancho Bernardo, which is now a community in San Diego. It was originally a cattle ranch owned by the Daleys, and in the 1960s it was subdivided and turned into a neighborhood. The Daleys then had the water tank disassembled and moved here with the plan of using it to start another housing development. It's a little hard to make out, but the RB painted all over the water tower with the backwards R was the brand for the ranch. Alright, it's time to take another detour and head to the top of Stanley Peak. So it looks like it's 0.7 miles to the top of Stanley Peak, so it should add about 1.5 miles to our hike, but hopefully we get some great views from up there. There's kind of a funny story how Stanley Peak got its name, or supposedly how Stanley Peak got its name. I can't verify the authenticity of the story, but around 1900 apparently there was a man named Stanley, and I don't know if it was his first name or his last name, but this man named Stanley went out for a morning walk and was gone pretty much the entire day. By the time he got home, everybody was worried about him and wondered where he'd been, and he said, well, see that mountain over there? I went to see what was at the top of it. And so they named the mountain Stanley Peak. Now, whether he actually climbed it or even existed, I'm not sure, but that's how this mountain got the name Stanley Peak. We're walking past this meadow, and I could just imagine hundreds of years ago, Native Americans living here. Or even 100 years ago when this was a ranch, this just being filled with cattle. Luckily, this place got saved and it's not filled with McMansions now. The camera always seems to flatten things out, but this trail is pretty steep so far. And the peak is somewhere up there. We can't quite see it yet. It would be funny if this Stanley guy never actually climbed this mountain, but was just hanging out at the bar all day and ended up getting a mountain named after him because of his story. We are now above the Rancho Bernardo water tank. We must be making progress because the water tank's getting smaller. I think we've almost made it to the top. I can hear some people talking up ahead. So we've made it to the top of Stanley Peak. There's a summit log, we'll sign it real quick. We'll take a look at some of the views from up here, see what else there is to see on top of Stanley Peak. And then we'll head back down and explore some more of the history of Daley Ranch. This area in front of us is Valley Center. And one of the mountains off in the distance is Palomar Mountain. I'm not sure which one. And down below us is the city of Escondido. It looks like the summit's geological survey marker is missing. The sign is letting us know what's off towards the east. Unfortunately, it's not in the best condition right now. But right over here is where the summit log is kept. So let's sign in. I almost missed this viewpoint over here to the west. Let's take a look. Oh yeah, this is a much better view over here. That's Escondido in front of us and San Marcos way off in the distance to the right. We've come down from Stanley Peak and we're now back on the main trail. And now we're going to head to where the historical ranch buildings are. It should be about 1.5 miles, 2 miles from here. Also, the further we've gotten into the ranch, the number of people we've come across has dropped considerably. Here's one of the ranch's ponds. This one is Mallard Pond. All of the ponds out here are man-made and were created for the cattle. And they do dry up from time to time. Despite being called Mallard Pond, I haven't seen a single duck. We have our first duck sighting, and it went under the water. Getting back to the Daleys and the history of this ranch. In 1880, Robert Daley married an American woman named Rebecca Breedlove, who was from Valley Center. The Daleys would go on to have 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, with one of the daughters dying in infancy. Over the years, Robert Daley would try out different businesses. In the 1890s, he opened a dairy here that would take butter to San Diego by stagecoach to be sold. He also tried his hand at breeding horses. The 2 Daley sons, Robert and Howard, both left the ranch in the early 1900s and headed to San Diego to run a construction business. They also continued to buy up as much land as they could. The Daley Corporation would go on to be the largest construction firm in San Diego County. The Daley Corporation would build much of San Diego's road infrastructure. Most of the early asphalt roads were built by the company. Here is the valley that Robert Daley first settled back in the 1860s. We've made it to the ranch buildings. The spot where Robert Daley built his first cabin is under a pond now, but some of these buildings do date back to the late 1800s. Robert Daley died in 1916, but the sons never sold off the ranch and leased it out to other ranchers. George Daley died in 1957. Howard wanted to retire in the same environment he grew up in, so he moved back to this ranch in the 1950s and died in 1962. I'm not sure what this building is. Unfortunately, none of these buildings are signed, but we can take a look inside. It's kind of hidden by the foliage, but this barn, I believe, is the oldest building here. It dates back to the late 1800s. Here's another look at the barn. An episode of the TV show Renegade starring Lorenzo Lamas was actually filmed over there. After George and Howard died, the Daley family continued to own the ranch up until the 1980s. Here's some old farm equipment. I'm not sure if any of this is original to the ranch or just brought here for educational purposes. The most prominent building here is the historic ranch house. This is where the Daleys lived and would continue to have family gatherings up until the 1980s. The ranch house was built in 1925, and they do tours of it one day a month. Unfortunately, that day is not today, and this is as close as we can get to it. The ranch house is actually currently under attack by a woodpecker. You can see woodpeckers have really done a number on the beams here. Visiting this place is like taking a step back in time, and I'm glad they had the sense to preserve it rather than turn it into a golf course. So that's our look at one of the true hidden gems of San Diego County, Daley Ranch. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and we'll see you next week.